Hey there, Psych 9 students, Professor Zeeb here, and we're going to now build on that last lecture that you saw. So we're going to take it a step forward and talk about some related issues, but also move the conversation forward a little bit. So let's go to our slides here. Okay, so what we're going to discuss in this little mini lecture are some of the current issues. In fact, some of them are classic issues in the field of development. In other words, these are some of the common debates that are still happening in the field of development. So as we go through these, you can kind of figure out which one you like better, or weigh the options here as we kind of go through the different debates. There's two major ones that we're going to talk about. Okay, so let's get into the issues of lifespan development, or some of our debates that continuously emerge in the field of development. The first one is what we call continuity versus discontinuity, So it turns out that we have what's called continuous type theorists, and we have the discontinuous. So let's kind of make sure we understand what those mean. So if you're on the continuous side of the fence, that basically means you believe that development proceeds steadily and sequentially. So really, what I get from that, or what you should get from that, is that when it comes to changing and developing as a human, it's more about changing very gradually and steadily. So this is a type of psychologist, for example, that believes that every day as a person, we change, but it's very, very little. And yet we are changing steadily each day. The classic theorist that we're going to talk about in this chapter is the very famous B.F. Skinner, the American behaviorist, who believed that we often, our development is shaped by exposure to rewards and consequences. In other words, kids that are rewarded for things are more likely to do them again. And if we're punished for something, then of course we would be less likely to do it. So the point is, based on the accumulation of those experiences every day, I mean, obviously a child experiences that several times a day probably, their development will sort of gradually change each day. So to me, what I get from that is that it's a continuous thing. It's something that happens all the time, but it's very steady and sort of gradual in nature. Okay, so there's some psychologists believe that our development kind of falls along those lines. On the other side of the coin, we have what's called the discontinuous theorists, who believe that development is a result of abrupt changes, or i.e. stages, if you will. So these are more our stage theorists. Some classic examples of that would be the very famous Jean Piaget and Sigmund Freud, which we'll learn about in this chapter and other chapters, where they believe that when we change and develop as a person, it's often very sudden and abrupt, almost like in a stepwise fashion, if you will. You guys see the difference there? On one side of the coin, they're saying it's more kind of gradual and steady as we're changing, where the discontinuous folks believe it's more like stepwise. So we make these sudden leaps and bounds in our changing of our development and so forth. So it's more sudden, it's more abrupt. Well, if you look at, once again, so people kind of line up on each side of that, and you can kind of figure out where you fall in that debate. But a lot of psychologists today now believe that they're both probably important. In fact, we see cases where both of them are in play. So for example, there may be certain things that are more gradual and steady, where some things are more abrupt in terms of how they happen. Just like an insect, a caterpillar would go through these stages and process to become a caterpillar, or obviously to become a butterfly as well down the road. It's very similar to that, where there may be sudden changes, but at the same time, during those stages, we see a very subtle sort of changing as well. So I'm going to leave it up to you guys which side of the fence you sort of sit on, but just make sure you know the difference between continuous and discontinuous. All right, that leads us to our next major debate, which is nature and nurture, which most of you have probably heard of in some capacity. So in other words, is our development a product of nature or is a product of nurture? So once again, this is another source of disagreement among different psychologists. In other words, what it's sort of asking is that when we develop and change, is it due to our inborn tendencies or is it due more to our surrounding world? I mean, that's just an easy way to kind of say it. So let's break this down here. Nature, for example, what they're basically saying here is that it's probably something that you're born with. You know, for example, genetics. Maybe your genetics explain who you are as a person and why you are the way you are. Where nurture is more about your environment. You know, for example, the way your parents raised you, the neighborhood you grew up in, and the experiences you had as a child. Those shaped and molded you as a person, and thus it was more a product of the environment. Okay, so let me just give you an example as we close out the lecture here, just to kind of demonstrate the difference between these. So essentially, you could argue it's genetics versus environment to kind of make it very basic. Let's say that I'm a school psychologist and a child has been referred to me, little Johnny, and Johnny is a very violent child. Unfortunately, Johnny beats up other kids for their lunch money. He's threatened his teacher. We just find that Johnny is a very violent dude, and we're trying to figure out why in the world is he acting this way? Why is he such a violent child or person? If I was on the nature side of the fence, I would say, wow, okay, so Johnny was born violent. When he was born, he had a certain gene that led to the overproduction of testosterone, for example, and that caused him to be violent. In other words, he was simply born this way. It was we see underpinnings from day one, possibly. I mean, if you could do that, I guess, with a child or the baby, I guess is what I'm saying. The point is that he was born this particular person, and that sort of set the table, so to speak, for his developmental course. On the other side of the fence, we have the nurture individuals, and so they would sort of believe, no, it's more of a product of his surrounding world, his environment, his experiences. So, for example, when we examine little Johnny's life, we notice that he grew up in a very violent neighborhood. Maybe there was gangs and violence all around, and he had to become violent to survive, basically. Or maybe he comes from a very violent home where mom and dad exchange physical abuse and things like that, and that's considered to be normal by him, and thus he was exposed to that, and it shaped who he is as a person. Do you guys see the difference here? So is it more of a product of who we are at birth based on, biological, as an example, biological underpinnings like genetics, or is it something that's more nurture-based, where it's exposure to certain variables in the world or experiences, for example? So there you go, guys. Those are two major debates: continuity versus discontinuity, nature versus nurture. Make sure you know the difference between those and are able to tell the difference. If I gave you an example, like the little Johnny example that we just sort of demonstrated, make sure you're able to kind of explain if it would be nature or nurture and what those actually mean, okay? So that will basically conclude our short little lecture here. I hope I made it very clear for you. They're pretty easy concepts to sort of understand. So if you ever have questions, guys, make sure you email me and we will see you online.